Good morning, home church. How you guys doing? Good, good, good. I hope you guys had a great week. I'm excited to be preaching today. We're continuing our series Brick by Brick. We're in a book study of the book of Nehemiah. Today we're going to be in chapter 2. Last week, Pastor George preached on Nehemiah chapter 1, and it was an incredible word. Let's give a round of applause for the man of God. And last week, as we were in Nehemiah 1, we saw that before Nehemiah did any work towards rebuilding a wall, he carried a burden. Before Nehemiah continued to help construct what was happening in Jerusalem, there was a conviction on the inside of him. God did a work on the inside of him. And when Nehemiah receives the report concerning Jerusalem, he learns that his people are in great trouble and disgrace, and that Jerusalem's walls is broken down and its gates have been burned. Nehemiah's response is revealing. He doesn't immediately develop a strategy, but he sits down, he weeps, he mourns, he prays, and he fasts. Because kingdom work, I believe, begins when the condition of God's people becomes the concern of God's people. I'll say it again so it doesn't fly over your head. I believe that kingdom work begins when the condition of God's people becomes the concern of God's people. The burden that drives Nehemiah into prayer and confession and ultimately action, that also connects directly to discipleship. Discipleship isn't simply knowing more about Jesus. Discipleship is becoming the kind of person that follows Christ. Discipleship is becoming the kind of person that follows him wherever obedience leads. Last week, Pastor George said a quote that I believe rang true and stuck with me. He said, "Without discipleship, we raise a generation that loves the cross but never carries it." And that's the danger of Christianity without discipleship. We can love sermons about sacrifice without sacrificing. We can sing songs about surrender without surrendering. We can celebrate what Jesus did on the cross while refusing to pick up ours. But biblical discipleship moves us from observation to participation. That's exactly what happens between Nehemiah chapter 1 and 2. Chapter 1, God breaks Nehemiah's heart. In chapter 2, Nehemiah gives God his hands. To appreciate chapter 2, we need to understand what has happened to Jerusalem. Centuries earlier, Jerusalem had been the political and spiritual center of Judah. The temple stood there, the Davidic kings ruled there, the city represented Israel's covenant history and identity. But because of generation of covenant rebellion, judgment came. In about 586 BC, Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and the temple and carried many of its people into exile. Later, Babylon fell into the Persian Empire. The Persian rulers allowed displaced people greater freedom to return to their homelands, and groups of Jewish exiles eventually returned to Judah. The temple had already been built by Nehemiah's time, but Jerusalem itself remained vulnerable. The temple had been restored, but the walls remained broken. That matters because in ancient cities, their walls weren't decorative. The walls represented security, stability, identity, civic order. A city without walls was exposed to enemies and humiliation. And Nehemiah isn't living in Jerusalem when he hears about this. He's in Susa, one of the Persian royal centers, serving King Artaxerxes I as a cupbearer. Nehemiah 2 places the events in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, commonly dated around 445 BC to 444. a cupbearer wasn't merely someone who poured drinks. This was a trusted royal position with close access to the king, which means God positioned Nehemiah in the palace before Nehemiah knew that there was an assignment in Jerusalem. Don't miss that. Sometimes you don't understand your placement until God reveals your purpose. The job that you have, the relationships that you have, the experience that you have, the influence that you've been given, God may position you somewhere today because of something he's prepared you to build tomorrow. Let's begin reading Nehemiah 2, verse 1. It says, "And it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of the king Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, 'Why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart.' So I became dreadfully afraid and said to the king, 'May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tomb, lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire?' Then the king said to me, 'What do you request?' So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tomb, that I may rebuild it.' Then the king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, 'How long will your journey be, and when will you return?' So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. Furthermore, I said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the regions beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, which permits to the temple, for the city wall, and for the house that I will occupy.' And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of God upon me." If you're taking notes today, the first point that I have is built in prayer. Built in prayer. Several months have passed from chapter 1 to chapter 2. And on one day, Nehemiah is serving the king, and the king notices something, that Nehemiah is sad. The king asks, "What's wrong?" Nehemiah begins to explain the condition of Jerusalem. Then Artaxerxes asks essentially, "What do you want?" I love Nehemiah's response because before he answers the king, he prays to God. Nehemiah 2:4 says, "So I prayed to the God of heaven." It seems to be a quick and silent prayer. In chapter 1, we see a long prayer in private, and in chapter 2, we see a short prayer in public. In the life of the believer, we must understand and learn that both are important. You need the prayer closet moments where you spend an extended amount of time in the presence of God, but you also need the kind of relationship with the Father where in the middle of a meeting or conversation or a crisis or opportunity, your heart can immediately turn towards heaven. And this is the life of the believer. That we are a people that consider God in all things. We're built in prayer. And notice that prayer didn't replace preparation. Because when the king asked Nehemiah what he wants, Nehemiah has an answer. He says, send me, give me time, give me letters for safe passage, give me authority to obtain timber. Nehemiah has been praying, but Nehemiah has also been planning. He's been praying and he's been planning. Trusting the sovereignty of God doesn't eliminate human responsibility. He's been praying and he's been planning. Nehemiah believes that God is going to open a door, but while waiting for God to open that door, Nehemiah gets ready to walk through it. He's been praying and he's been planning. I believe that this shows us that our faith isn't passive. And prayer isn't an excuse for poor preparation. Sometimes we say we're waiting on God, and God is saying, you've prayed about it, now I need you to prepare for it. He's been praying, and he's been planning. You've prayed about serving, but have you considered where to serve? You've prayed about your marriage and your children, but have you had the conversations that you need to? You've prayed about your neighbor, but have you invited them over? We need to pray, and we need to plan. I believe the principle here is a God-given burden should eventually produce God-directed action. A God-given burden should eventually produce God-directed action. Artaxerxes signed the letters. He supplied the timber. He provided protection. And in all of this, Nehemiah understood and said at the end that it was because of the hand of God that was upon him. So he understood that the king may have been the one that was holding the pen, but God ultimately was the one holding the king. And if I could tell you something about your God, James 1:17 says, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. God has been good, he will be good, and he will continue in the future. We serve a God that in a moment can turn prayer into action. In a moment can turn weeping into praise. In a moment can turn our worries into our victories. That's the God that we serve. So what burdens have you been praying about that God is now asking you to prepare for? Burden must become prayer. And prayer must become preparation. And preparation must become obedience. We're going to continue reading in verse 9. It says, then I went to the governors in the region beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. And when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. I told no one what God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem, nor was there any animal with me except the one which I rode. And I went out by night through the valley gate at the Serpent Well and the Refuse Gate, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates, which were burned with fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal under me to pass. So I went up in the night by the valley, and I viewed the wall. Then I turned back and entered by the valley gate, so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or others who did the work. Point number 2 is built with purpose. built with purpose. Nehemiah finally arrives in Jerusalem, and something fascinating happens. He doesn't immediately announce the vision. He doesn't call a conference or gather everyone together to say, hey guys, God has sent me to do this. Instead, after 3 days, Nehemiah goes out at night with only a few people. Scripture says, I had not told anyone what God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. Then Nehemiah begins inspecting the walls. Why? Because vision without assessment is just presumption. Vision without assessment is just presumption. Nehemiah knew the walls were broken before he arrived. But hearing the walls were broken and actually assessing the brokenness of the walls are different things. He needed to see it, to understand it, to count the cost, to know what they were getting themselves into. And this is where discipleship can get a little bit uncomfortable, because you cannot rebuild what you're unwilling to inspect. Before rebuilding relationships, inspect them. Before rebuilding your spiritual life, inspect it. Before rebuilding your family, inspect the rhythms of your home. Before discipling others, inspect your own walk with Christ first. And that's not for condemnation, because there's a difference between condemnation and conviction. Condemnation says, look how broken you are, there's no hope. But conviction says, I see what's broken, now let's rebuild. And the gospel allows us to expect the ruins in our lives without being destroyed by shame. Because our identity is ultimately not determined by the condition of our walls, but our identity is ultimately determined by the grace of a good God. And what I believe is noteworthy about Nehemiah's story here is that God put something in his heart, but Nehemiah didn't immediately tell everyone, and I believe that that's maturity. Not everything that God puts in you needs to immediately come out of you. Sometimes vision needs time in the presence of God before it's announced in the presence of people. And Jesus modeled this kind of intentionality. He didn't simply gather crowds, but he invested deeply into disciples. Kingdom building isn't merely about gathering people around a moment, but it's about forming people for a mission. So ask yourself, where are the walls? Where are the broken walls in my life? Maybe your prayer life has some gaps. Maybe your marriage has some gaps. Maybe your integrity has some gaps. Maybe your family discipleship has some gaps. Maybe your commitment to the local church has some gaps. Maybe you've learned how to look spiritually strong while privately leaving entire sections of the walls of your life untouched. Don't be afraid to inspect it. Because I believe God reveals brokenness when he intends to restore it. He reveals brokenness when he intends to restore it. And continuing on, verse 17, it says, Then I said to them, you see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire. Come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. So they said, let us rise up and build. Then they set their hands to do this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you are doing? Will you rebel against the king? So I answered them and said to them, The God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem. The third point is built for opposition. Built for opposition. After Nehemiah has prayed and prepared and traveled and inspected, now he speaks. He gathers the people and essentially says that you see the condition that we're in. The Jerusalem is broken. Let's rebuild. Then he tells them about the gracious hand of God that was upon him, and he tells them what the king has said, and the people's response is essentially, let's start rebuilding. Let's do this. So they begin the good work. And I believe that this is a picture of good discipleship. Nehemiah's burden has become their burden. Nehemiah's vision has become their vision. Nehemiah doesn't say, watch me build. He says, come, let us build. That's the difference between being a spectator and being a disciple. Church was never meant to be designed for crowds watching a few people carry the mission. Every disciple is called into the work of God. But notice what happens immediately after the people decide to build. Opposition appears. Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, they mock them, they ridicule them, they question their motives, they accuse them of rebellion. And here's something that we have to understand. Opposition is not always evidence that you've missed God. Sometimes opposition shows up precisely because you started obeying him. Before Nehemiah arrived, nobody was worried. Why? Because broken walls aren't threatening. But the moment someone says, let's rebuild, opposition notices. The enemy doesn't have to attack ruins that are content to remain ruins. But when marriages start rebuilding, when fathers start rebuilding, when young people decide to live holy, when believers start spreading the gospel, when churches stop entertaining spectators and start making disciples, that's when resistance comes. When Christians decide that they're going to carry their cross instead of merely just admiring Jesus's. Nehemiah's response is powerful. He doesn't spend the rest of the chapter arguing with his critics. But he says, the God of heaven will give us success. The God of heaven will cause us to prosper. We, his servant, will start rebuilding. In other words, our confidence isn't in ourselves. Our confidence is in the God who's called us. Nehemiah understands something every disciple needs to understand. You don't need everyone's approval when you've already had God's assignment. Don't spend your energy explaining your obedience. Continue to build. Continue to build. Before Nehemiah had a plan, he had a burden. Before he had a burden, he heard about brokenness. Before he started building, he started praying. Before God changed the walls around Nehemiah, God was doing something on the inside of Nehemiah. But ultimately, Nehemiah isn't the hero of the Bible. Jesus is. And this is a beautiful gospel trajectory that is happening here. Nehemiah heard about the broken condition of his people. Jesus saw the broken condition of humanity. Nehemiah left the palace for a ruined city. Jesus left the glory of heaven to enter into our broken world. Nehemiah risked his position before a king. Jesus gave his life on a cross. Nehemiah came to rebuild Jerusalem's walls, and Jesus came to reconcile sinners to God and build himself a people for his glory. Jesus didn't merely look at our ruins from a distance. He entered them. He carried our sins. He bore our judgment. He died on our cross. He rose victoriously. Then Jesus turns to his followers and in essence says, "Follow me." And I believe that that's why the line from last week matters so much. Without discipleship, we raise a generation that loves the cross but never carries it, because the cross isn't merely something that Christians admire. The way of the cross is something that disciples embrace. Jesus carried his cross for our redemption. And now, because we have been redeemed, we ourselves deny ourselves, take up our cross, and we follow him. We follow him. What has God burdened you to build? Don't waste the burden. I love that after Nehemiah goes forth and tells the people and encourages the people to build. I love that afterwards that they all look at him and they say, "Let us rise up and build." It says, then they set their hands to do this good work. Their response to him was, "Let's build," because they could understand the difference between a good thing and a God thing. Sometimes we can see good things and know that that's not what I'm called to. But when we see the difference between a good thing and a God thing, then we know when it's time to build and when it's not. Their answer is, "Let us rise up and build." I believe that God is calling us collectively to build. But I believe that in our individual lives that there's things that need rebuilding. Whatever burden that God has placed on the inside of you, he will resource you to rebuild. So don't waste the burden. Take the burden in prayer and then prepare for it. That we can say, by the grace of God, it doesn't have to stay this way. What wall has God put on your heart? What broken place has he been showing you? Who are you discipling? Where have you been burdened but not yet become obedient? These are the questions that we must ask ourselves so that today our burden can turn into a response. Pray about it. Name it. Take one concrete step of obedience. Then say what the people of Jerusalem said. Let us rise up and build. It is time for us to build. Not because we're strong enough, not because opposition won't come, not because rebuilding will be easy, but because, like Nehemiah said, the gracious hand of our God is upon his people. The God of heaven will prosper his purposes. All we need to do is arise and build. We're built for this. If we can, in the moment, let's all stand. I believe there's so much wisdom to draw from Nehemiah. But we even see with Nehemiah that there was fear in bringing forth the request. It says that the king asked, "What do you request?" And it says that Nehemiah was afraid. And I believe that it was because he was afraid that he took that moment of prayer. He took that moment to say, before I speak, let me ready my heart for this burden that's been on the inside of me. To speak it out. To ask the king to supply the need so that I can rebuild what he's burdened my heart to rebuild. Whatever that is specifically on the inside of you. I believe in this moment, God is asking you, what is your request? And there's no fear. But he's asking you because he intends to supply it. Supply the need for you to rebuild whatever that is. What's impossible with man is possible with God. And so we can trust in his goodness and strength.